Welcome to chapter 20. In this chapter, we are going to talk about the politics of the Roaring Twenties. Specifically, we're going to look at the waves that characterize post war America, what tarnished Harding's presidency, and how did the fabric of American life begin to change. Riveting, I know. So, after the war ends, you have a series of soldiers that are coming home from the war. Now, at this time, remember, there are a lot of women and African Americans, especially in these jobs. Those people start to leave the workforce in order to, rehire the soldiers and the men back. However, farmers and factory workers are getting way less work than they were getting in the war. So not only are there no jobs because minorities and women had them, but now there's not even enough jobs to keep those people employed because the wartime orders are ending. At the same time, you have the cost of living rising, which means it's becoming more expensive to live in America. Things cost more, but people aren't making more money. And then finally, there's a big debate over the League of Nations. So this really causes two main controversies. One, nativism, which is the prejudice against foreign-born people, not porn people. That's embarrassing. The idea that keep America for the Americans, that there's not enough jobs for the Americans as it is, so don't, increase the amount of immigrants that are coming in. Also, the idea of isolationism, and we talked about this when we talked about imperialism. The idea that America was just involved in this world war. It's time to leave worldwide politics and just focus on America. The best example of nativism is with the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. And this happens when these two Italians, Sacco and Vanzetti, are accused of robbing a store. The witness said that the thieves looked quote unquote Italian. And this is the best example of this nativist attitude that, they were these two men, they looked Italian, so they must be the crime, must have done the crime, even though there was little evidence to support it. They were sentenced to death, and the verdict's still out as to whether they committed the crime. There's evidence that Sacco had the gun and the bullet matched the victim, and this came out in 1961. But they don't know if he was the one who shot it or not. So, the verdict's kind of out. But it sparked protests throughout the world about this idea that America, the land of immigrants, was no longer welcoming them. This brings us on to the idea of the quota system. From 1919 to 1921, America increased production by 600%. And so, as a result of this increase, the emergency quota system of 1924 went into effect, and it limited the number of immigrants that could enter the U.S. from each country. But think about it. This time, the war's over. A lot of European countries are in destruction after the war, and so people are looking for a fresh start and move to the United States. You have a high increase during this time from Italians, Polish, Portuguese, and Germans, countries that, especially Poland and Italy, that were affected by World War I, where outcomes job-wise and socially are not very well. They're not looking too hot, so they come to America. So the quota system puts a limit. It takes each culture or each country and decides how many people from each country can come to the United States per year. And once America in that year hit the quota, so let's say only 100,000 Polish people can come to the United States a year. Once the United States hit that quota, they would not admit any more Poles into the United States. And the numbers that they picked were the ones to represent or to reflect American ideals. So there was a high number of Great British, Irish, and Scandinavian immigrants that could come in, and not many Southern Europeans or Asians. Okay. At the same time that you have this quota system, you have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which is a white supremacy group. I'm sure you're familiar with it. They really get their start at this time, and they are the most popular. They opposed Roman Catholics and Jews, so they're actually Protestants. and here's a picture of him. Their idea is that you're going to put blacks in their place, that they're inferior to whites, and they should know that. They should work in jobs that are inferior. They should do things like that. They often dominated police forces, whether it's local polices, state polices, so they had a lot of support. And then they had their highest attendance rate in 1929 when it reached 4.5 million participants. And this goes back to the idea that, the United States at this time is using nativist ideas. It's not welcoming immigrants. There's also a fear of the unknown. Right now in Russia in 1919, you have the Communist Revolution that's going over. You have Lenin here in the picture who's transforming Russia into the USSR and using the idea of communism. And communism takes the form that it's an economic and political system where a single party is ruled by a dictator to equalize wealth. Now, this isn't what communism is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a form of socialism where everyone's equal, but it doesn't turn out that way. And as a result, there's a communist party in America. And this formation of the party scares Americans, especially the U.S. Attorney General Palmer. And he created or he appointed J. Edgar Hoover to oversee what are now called the Palmer Raids. And it's backed by this idea that there's a Red Scare, or the fear of communism in America. And J. Edgar Hoover used this fear and collected evidence against anyone who suspected of communists, socialists, anarchists. But they didn't find really any evidence that these people were bad. But it starts the idea that we're fearing something that we don't know. Communism. It's this, big, ugly devil that we fear for a long time, and it actually is the reason for the Cold War, which we'll get to in a few decades. So at the same time, now that the war is over, strikes are able to resume, and strikers are able to leave work. During the war, remember, it was unpatriotic and actually illegal to strike because you couldn't be striking during war. We needed to maximize production and help the soldiers, give them all the supplies they need. So once the war is over, the cost of living increases at this time. But at the same time, wages stay constant. So things are becoming more expensive, but people don't have enough money to pay for the additional expensive things. And so by 1919, the year after the war was over, there were over 3,000 strikes around the United States, compared to, virtually zero in the years before. Some of the major strikes were the Boston police strike, where the police had not gotten a raise since the start of World War I and actually walked off the job. And here Governor Coolidge, who was the governor of Massachusetts, said there is no right to strike because it's against public safety. And he was hailed as a hero for making the police officers go back to work. Then you have the steel mill strike. And steel workers wanted an 8-hour day and the right to unionize. And the Steel Corporation refused to negotiate at all with them. And so 300,000 steel workers across the country went on strike. Strikers were beaten by police, and the companies, especially the U.S. Steel Corporation, used propaganda to associate them with communists. Now remember, at this time, there's a Red Scare going on, so J. Edgar Hoover's investigating potential communists. So people who are striking for better working conditions are getting lumped in with a group of, communists and socialists who they don't agree with at all. Then finally, in January 1923, a report on the hard conditions of the steel industry shocked the United States, and so the steel company finally agreed to the 8-hour workday and improved conditions. The last major strike that happens at this time was on November 11th, when coal miners, who had been organizing since the 1890s, went on strike. Attorney Palmer, who was also the one who led the attempt against the Palmer raids against the communists, forced the strikers back to work, or he tried to. And President Wilson at this time then appointed an arbitrator to look at both sides and come up with an agreement where the miners got a 27% increase. So at this time, you're finally seeing workers take a voice for themselves, use their voice, and then companies are realizing that they can no longer take advantage of the workers. And so there's compromise happening around America. So let's move on to President Harding. He had this idea of the return to normalcy, the idea that America should be going back to what it was before the war, going back to the normal. And so when he came to the Oval Office, he had a series of problems, which included arms control of worldwide countries, a series of war debts that other countries owed to each other and to the United States, and the reconstruction of really a war-torn continent. So there's big issues that he has. And he does start off very successfully. He has his Secretary of State hold the Washington Naval Conference, where the U.S., Great Britain, Japan, France, and Italy met. Not Russia, because remember, we're fearing them because they're communists. We don't trust them. And for the first time, the major players of the world agreed to reduce their arms. They agreed to scrap battleships, cruisers, and aircraft destroyers. So it's really the idea of, the world's coming together peacefully to reduce the number of arms, and hopefully, this won't escalate again into a huge war. Because if you remember, one of the main causes for the war, the M was militarism, the rise in the production of, all things military. So if you can reduce that, the idea is you would prevent another war. They also tried the Kellogg-Briand Pact, where the U.S. would renounce war as a policy. This ends up to fail, but it's signaling to the world that we are trying to prevent war, and we don't believe in it ourselves. Then he also has the Fordney-McCumber tariff, and this comes in 1922. When America proposed a tariff on U.S. imports of 60%. So anything that you bought that came from another country, there would be a 60% tax on it. So if you were going to buy shoes that were made in Italy for $1, all of a sudden it became $1.60, for example. As opposed to you could buy a pair of shoes that were made in America maybe for $1.20. So the idea is that you would go with the cheaper thing. At this time. And so France and Britain owed the U.S. $10 billion, and they couldn't sell enough goods to the U.S. because of this tax here. Because the tax was so high, they couldn't sell their goods. And so in order to pay back their debt, they looked to Germany to collect the reparations that Germany owed them. Now remember, if you think about the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to pay France and Britain reparations for all the damages they caused in the war. And this was the money they were going to use. Unfortunately, Germany couldn't pay back all this money and defaulted on, all the reparations. And so France marched into Germany, marched its troops there. And so the world was kind of watching, hoping that a whole nother war wouldn't break out. And Charles Dawes, actually an American banker, helped to create this plan where the U.S. would loan Germany money. And Germany would then take this money and loan it to France and Britain to pay back the United States. So it's this whole big circle. But the U.S. is really loaning money to Germany to prevent war. In the end, the goal is that, or the hope is that the United States will get all its money back. Even though Harding has some good things that he does in his policy, he's often remembered as one of the worst American presidents. Overall, he favored a limited role in government, that the idea that business should be able to operate on its own. And he starts, by nominating some great people on his cabinet. You have Charlie Evans Hughes, the Secretary of State, who organized that very successful conference to reduce arms. You have Herbert Hoover, who's the Secretary of Commerce. He'll become a future president of the United States. You have Andrew Mellon, who is one of the richest people in the United States, and he's the Secretary of Commerce. He reduces taxes and American debt at this time, so he's great. Unfortunately, President Harding's cabinet is really characterized by this Ohio gang. And this comes from the idea that Harding is from Ohio, and he nominated a bunch of his cronies or his friends to be on the cabinet, and they were so corrupt, and they had so many corrupt dealings, they tarnished his reputation. The best example is the Teapot Dome scandal, where the government set aside this land in Teapot, Wyoming, and also in California, for the U.S. Navy. The Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, then used this land and actually sent it to the Interior Department. So this is kind of now it's the Secretary of the Homeland of all things America. And he then used it once it was in his department to lease to private oil companies. And in the process, he got over $400,000 in stocks and loans and money and kickbacks. So the idea that Harding's cronies really were running the government for themselves. Harding leaves office in 1923, and you have Coolidge, who won in 1924, and he uses the slogan, "Keep it cool with Coolidge." He's very pro-business. He wants to keep taxes down, business profits up, keep minimum government interference, high tariffs on imported goods. The whole goal is to help Americans produce, because when producers have more money, then they can hire more people, and then those people's wages would go up. So the idea that if the government didn't give a lot of handouts but let business really run itself, it would kind of trickle down and help all areas of society, which it did. In the end, wages rose, and more people began to be hired. Outside of politics, you have finally a social movement, and that's why the Roaring Twenties is remembered as fondly as it is because it's really a time of social movement. You have the automobile, which for the first time is linking the country. And the best example here is Route 66, which goes across, it starts in Chicago, actually, and goes all across the southern United States to Los Angeles. And with the car, you're able to do this. It also leads to urban sprawl, which is the idea of, the unplanned spreading of cities. So before, if you have a city like Chicago here, and you worked in the city, because that's where the factories were, you would have to live in the city. And hopefully you could walk to work, or you had enough money where you could take a public transportation of some sort. With the car, and especially the Model T, which is, affordable for many middle-class Americans, people then can work in the city at the factories or wherever, and then live in the outskirts of the city. So this is the rise of suburbia. This is what we have today, where people live in the suburbs and commute to the city to work, or vice versa. A lot of people live in the city, they're young, they love the city life, but they work in the suburbs. And this is what the automobile does. It's changing the fabric of American society. Instead of being either rural or in the city, we have the first ever middle ground, suburbia. And then finally, the overall standard of living in America is improving exponentially at this time. In this period, America owns 40% of the world's wealth. That's crazy. America is a small portion of the world population, but we own over half of the wealth. You have things like airplanes that are expanding to a form of actual popular transportation, and as a result, you have Pan American Airlines, which was founded and completes the first transatlantic passenger flight. Electricity is not only in businesses, but it's going into homes so people can stay up late. They have lights. Eventually, they'll get radios in their house and all the different inventions that come with electricity. And then you have the expansion of modern advertising. This is actually a Listerine advertisement from 1923 preventing halitosis or bad breath. And so the idea that you have advertising that's going to get people to buy these new modern products. Eventually, you're going to have things like that come in this decade. The washing machine. You're going to have the radio that becomes so important. You're going to have the vacuum cleaner that comes out, the sewing machine. So it's, changing how America is living their lives. Both the housewives, the husbands, the children were finally moving into the era of luxury. And one way we do that is through the installment plan. And this is the idea of buying on credit. Think of a credit card. That's the best way to do it. When you buy, let's say you're going to buy an iPad that's $500. You don't actually need $500 in cash. You just have to buy on credit. Um, and that's the idea that, you swipe your card, and then in the next month, you're going to get a bill saying you owe $500 for that iPad. And either you pay it all at once, you pay the $500 off, you have no more balance, or you can pay a little bit at a time, an installment plan. So you didn't need to save up, save up, save up till you had all enough money to buy this thing. You could buy it on credit with the expectation that over time you would pay it off. And so this is when people start to buy these luxurious goods like cars and washing machines and vacuum cleaners and sewing machines, that really makes America luxurious. So I hope this video was for the entire chapter 20, so I tried to condense it as best as possible. But really, what are the waves that are hitting in post-America? You have nativism, you have anti-immigrants, you have the idea that America is trying to, leave world politics, so you have isolationism. Then Harding's presidency was tarnished by a series of scandals, and we'll talk about this more in class, that really tarnished everything he did well. And then you have this foundation of American fabric, the fabric of society that's changing. You have modern conveniences, electricity, you have the car, and so America is really becoming this big superpower at the time, full of luxury, the country that we're known for today. So we'll talk about this more, but this is where we will leave it for today. That's all for now, Husky historians. Until next time.